Story 1. The Final Show. I should never have stayed after the final show because what I saw that night forever changed my perception of what really happens when the circus lights go out. My name is Carlos, and I worked as a sound technician for the Red Moon Circus, a company that traveled through the most remote towns in Mexico, bringing joy to entire families. Or at least that's what we all believed who were part of the show. It was a particularly cold November night when I decided to stay in the main tent to check some cables that had been giving problems during the performance. The wind was hitting the canvas with force and producing a disturbing sound that put my nerves on edge, but I needed to finish the work before we reached the next town. All my colleagues had already retired to their trailers. The clowns had removed their makeup, the acrobats had stored their equipment, and even Mario, the lion tamer, had secured the cages of his felines before going to rest. The tent was completely empty, only illuminated by a work lamp that I had placed near the technical area, and the silence was so deep that I could hear my own breathing while I untangled the cables. It was then when I heard the first strange sound, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the sand. But when I looked up, there was no one there. Only the shadows cast by the pools and the empty bleachers that seemed to watch me with a disturbing intensity. I decided to ignore the noise and continue with my work, thinking it could be some animal that had gotten into the tent, but the sound repeated, this time louder and clearly heading toward where I was. My heart began to beat faster when I saw a figure moving among the shadows, a silhouette that I couldn't identify, but that definitely didn't belong to any of my colleagues. It was too tall and moved in a strange way, as if its joints weren't working properly. The work lamp began to flicker, creating a strobe effect that made the figure appear and disappear from my sight, and in each flash I could see that it was getting closer and closer to where I was. Fear took hold of me when I recognized what I was seeing. It was Beto, our main clown. But something was terribly wrong with him. His characteristic smile had become a grotesque grimace that extended far beyond what was humanly possible. His eyes were completely black and his skin had a grayish tone that reminded me of a corpse. His clown suit, which during the day was colorful and cheerful, now appeared stained with something dark that I didn't want to imagine what it could be. And his enormous shoes made a wet sound against the sand as he walked toward me with jerky and unnatural movements. I tried to run, but my legs felt like jelly, and when I finally managed to move, I realized I wasn't alone. All the circus figures were there. The acrobats hung in the air without ropes or nets, their necks bent at impossible angles. The tamer had his hands covered with blood, and his lions followed him with glassy eyes and open jaws showing fangs that dripped something that wasn't saliva. The carousel music began to play by itself, but distorted and at a speed that made the cheerful melody become something sinister and disturbing, while the circus lights turned on and off to the rhythm of that infernal music. I took refuge behind the technical area trying to find an exit, but every time I looked in some direction, I saw more figures emerging from the darkness. They were all the circus artists, but transformed into grotesque versions of themselves. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too bright, and they all looked at me with an intensity that froze my blood. It was then when I understood the horrible truth. The Red Moon Circus had never been a normal shell. It was a trap. A place where souls were trapped forever, condemned to repeat their performances for all eternity, and I had just become part of the shell. The last thing I remember before everything went black was Beto's laughter, a cackle that resonated throughout the tent and seemed to come from everywhere at the same time. And when I woke up, I was no longer Carlos the sound technician. Now I'm part of the shell, and every night when the lights go out, I go out to look for someone new who can join our eternal horror spectacle. Story 2. The Mirror Tent. The smell of rancid popcorn and fermented cotton candy hit my face when I entered that tent, But it wasn't until I saw my own reflection multiplied infinitely that I knew I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I'm Anna, and I was barely 17 years old when my family decided to visit the Silva Brothers circus that had arrived in our small town in the mountains of Guatemala. It was the first time in years that something exciting happened in our place, and we were all anxious to enjoy a different night. The circus had set up its camp on the outskirts of town, where there used to be a fair that closed after several strange accidents scared away visitors. But no one seemed to remember those incidents when the colorful lights of the circus illuminated the night. My parents and younger siblings went directly to see the clowns and animals, but I was attracted to a smaller tent that was set apart from the main area. It had a sign that said House of Magic Mirrors and an entrance guarded by a thin, pale man who wore a completely faded black suit. The man had a disturbing smile and eyes that seemed to see more than they should, and when I approached to ask about the entrance fee, he told me that for me, it would be completely free because I had the perfect face for the mirrors. I should have distrusted that phrase, but curiosity was stronger than common sense, and I entered the tent without thinking twice. What I found inside was a labyrinth of mirrors of different shapes and sizes. Some made me look tall and thin, others made me appear short and chubby, and several more distorted my image in ways that made me laugh out loud. At first, everything seemed normal and fun. I walked through the narrow hallways between the mirrors trying to find the exit while I entertained myself seeing all the strange versions of myself. But after several minutes, I began to notice that something was wrong, very wrong. The reflections began to act independently. When I raised my right hand, my reflection raised the left one. When I smiled, my image in the mirror frowned. And most disturbing was that some reflections remained motionless while I kept walking, as if they had frozen in time. The labyrinth seemed to get bigger with every step I took. The hallways multiplied and branched in directions that made no geometric sense, and no matter how much I tried to remember the path I had taken to enter, everything looked exactly the same. The lighting began to change gradually. The bright lights at the beginning became dimmer and more yellowish, casting strange shadows that moved independently of my body and created shapes that seemed to be alive. It was when I reached a particular section of the labyrinth that the real horror began. I found a mirror that didn't reflect my current image, but showed versions of myself from different ages. I could see 5-year-old Anna crying inconsolably, 10-year-old Anna with an expression of absolute terror, and an adult Anna who seemed to have aged decades in seconds and whose face showed a terrible and disturbing wisdom. All these reflections looked directly into my eyes and moved their lips as if they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear any sound. Only the distorted echo of my own breathing that seemed to come from all directions at the same time. I tried to move away from that particular mirror, but I discovered I couldn't. My feet seemed to be glued to the ground, and no matter how much force I applied, I couldn't move even a centimeter. Meanwhile, the reflections in all the surrounding mirrors began to make desperate gestures, pointing towards something that was behind me. When I finally managed to turn my head, I saw the most horrible thing I have ever seen in my life. It was a version of myself, but completely disfigured, with gray and cracked skin, completely white eyes without pupils, and a smile that extended from ear to ear, showing teeth sharp like knives. This diabolical version of Anna walked toward me with spasmodic movements, dragging her feet and emitting a guttural sound that filled me with indescribable terror. And when she was close enough, she extended a bony hand toward my face and whispered with a voice that was and wasn't mine that now I would be part of the mirrors forever. The last thing I remember is the sensation of extreme cold invading my body and the perception that I was sinking into something liquid and thick. And when I regained consciousness, I realized I was on the other side of the mirror, looking outward, waiting for the next curious victim who wants to know the House of Magic Mirrors. Where I am now, just one of the many trapped reflections desperately trying to warn visitors about the horror that awaits them if they venture too deep into this labyrinth of nightmares. Story 3. The Midnight Clown. The last time I saw my brother Leo alive was when he told me he had found work in a traveling circus, but what came to our house 3 months later was no longer my brother, but something that used his face as a mask. My name is Diego, and this story began last summer when our parents died in a car accident, and Leo, who was 5 years older than me, had to take care of me and all the debts our parents had left behind. The economic situation was desperate. We had lost the family home and were living in a small apartment we could barely afford. Leo worked 3 different jobs, but still couldn't generate enough money to keep us afloat, and I could see how stress and worry were consuming him day by day. One July morning, he appeared at home more animated than I had seen him in months. He told me he had met a man who had offered him work in a circus that traveled throughout Central America. The salary was excellent and included accommodation and food. The only strange thing was that the job consisted of being a clown, but without needing prior experience because they themselves would take care of training him. Leo had never shown interest in that type of entertainment. In fact, he had always been afraid of clowns since he was little. But economic desperation was stronger than his phobias, and he accepted the job without thinking about it too much. He promised me he would return in 3 months with enough money to solve all our problems, and that meanwhile, I would stay with our Aunt Maria, an older woman who lived alone and had agreed to take care of me during his absence. The first 2 months I received regular letters from Leo where he told me about his adventures in the circus. He described his companions as strange but friendly people, mentioned that the training to be a clown was more intense than he had imagined, but that he was learning quickly, and always ended the letters saying he missed me very much and that soon we would be together again. However, during the 3rd month, the letters stopped coming, and no matter how much I tried to contact him by phone, I never managed to communicate with him. Aunt Maria began to worry and even contacted the police, but there was no way to track a traveling circus that constantly changed location. It was an October night when he finally returned. I heard someone knocking on Aunt Maria's apartment door with a strange pattern. It wasn't normal knocking, but a rhythmic sequence that seemed like a disturbing melody. And when I opened the door, I found Leo standing on the threshold dressed completely as a clown. His makeup was perfect but disturbing. His face was completely white with a red smile that extended far beyond his natural lips. His eyes were outlined with black in a way that made them appear larger and deeper. And he wore a traditional clown suit with bright colors that contrasted sinisterly with the darkness of the night. The strangest thing was his behavior. He didn't speak normally, but everything he said was done with a high-pitched and sing-song voice, as if he were acting for an invisible audience, and his movements were exaggerated and theatrical even for the simplest gestures. When I tried to ask him about his experience in the circus and why he had stopped writing, he only answered me with nonsensical jokes and jokes that weren't funny but rather disturbing, as if he had forgotten how to maintain a normal conversation and could only communicate through his clown character. Aunt Maria felt so uncomfortable with his presence that she decided to stay at a neighbor's house that night, leaving me alone with this stranger who insisted he was my brother but behaved like a complete unknown. During the early morning, I woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the living room. I found Leo sitting on the sofa laughing alone while looking at the empty wall, as if he were watching the funniest show in the world. But when I approached to ask what he was doing, he turned toward me, and I saw something in his eyes that froze my blood. They no longer had the light brown color that Leo had always had. Now they were completely black and seemed to have no depth, as if they were holes that led nowhere. His smile became even wider when he saw me, and he began to tell me about the wonders of the circus. about how he had learned that laughter was the most important thing in the world, and that his new mission was to make all the people he met laugh, regardless of whether they wanted to laugh or not. And while he spoke to me, I could see that under the white makeup there were strange marks on his skin, as if someone had sewn pieces of different faces together to create the face he now had. I realized that my brother Leo had disappeared forever, and that what was in front of me was a creature that had taken his form to fulfill some sinister purpose. And when I tried to escape from the apartment, he followed me while laughing in a way that didn't sound human, and shouted that now I too could join the circus and learn the secrets of eternal happiness. But that happiness he offered sounded more like a condemnation than a blessing. Story 4. The Eternal Performance. Something is terribly wrong when circus performers keep acting after their bodies have stopped moving. But I didn't know it until I became one of them, and now I can't stop my performance. I'm Rosa, and I was a professional acrobat who traveled throughout South America performing in different circuses. I had dedicated my entire life to perfecting my skills in the air, and was known for performing acrobatics that others considered impossible. My specialty was the trapeze without a safety net, because I believed that real danger was what made the performance truly exciting. When the Midnight Circus offered me a contract for a full season with the highest salary I had seen in my career, I immediately accepted without asking too many questions about the company's reputation or about the strange clauses that appeared in the contract. The circus had a particularity that I found interesting at first. They only presented night functions, and never in the same place 2 nights in a row. They always moved to different towns after each performance, and the artists lived in trailers that formed a small nomadic community that constantly moved along dark and lonely roads. My companions were talented but strangely silent people. They rarely talked about their past or their families, and they all seemed to have a sickly pallor that I initially attributed to the fact that we only worked at night and spent the day sleeping in closed spaces. The routine was always the same. We arrived at a town at sunset. We set up the main tent and secondary attractions with supernatural efficiency that impressed me, and at 11 o'clock at night sharp the function began regardless of whether there was a large or small audience. During the first weeks, everything seemed normal. I performed my acrobatics with the same passion as always, and the audience responded with enthusiasm to my presentations. But gradually, I began to notice disturbing details that at first I tried to ignore, but that became more evident with each function. The other artists never seemed tired no matter how demanding their performance was. They didn't sweat. They didn't breathe with difficulty after exhausting routines, and their movements had a mechanical precision that was admirable but also disturbing, as if they were machines programmed to execute the same sequences over and over again. The circus director, a tall and thin man called Mr. Shadow, never came out during the day and only appeared moments before each function began, always dressed in the same black suit and a top hat that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. And when he spoke, his voice had a strange echo, as if it came from very far away or very deep. One night, after a particularly intense function, I decided to stay awake to observe what my companions did when they thought no one was watching them. What I discovered filled me with a terror that even now, trapped in this eternal nightmare, I still can't completely overcome. The artists didn't go to sleep like normal people. They simply remained motionless in their positions until it was time for the next function, like marionettes hanging from invisible strings waiting for someone to activate them again. And during those hours of immobility, their eyes remained open but completely empty, staring into nothingness with an expression that was neither of life nor death, but something in between and disturbing. I tried to escape that same night. I packed my few belongings and walked toward the road, hoping to find some vehicle that would take me away from that place. But no matter how much I walked or in what direction I headed, I always ended up back at the circus camp, as if I were trapped in an invisible loop from which I couldn't escape. Mr. Shadow was waiting for me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and explained with disturbing calm that I had signed a contract that committed me much more than I had initially understood. It wasn't just for a season, but for all eternity. And now I was part of the permanent function of the Midnight Circus, where artists never age, never die, but also never really live again. Every night since then, I have performed exactly the same trapeze routine, with the same movements, the same jumps, the same pirouettes, without being able to change a single detail of my performance. While I feel how my soul fades a little more with each function and my body becomes an empty shell that only exists for the entertainment of audiences that are not completely human either. The most horrible thing is that I maintain my consciousness trapped inside this body that no longer belongs to me. I can see and hear everything that happens around me, but I can't control my actions. I can only observe while my hands grip the trapeze ropes and my body executes movements that I no longer feel as my own. And every night, I see new naive artists like me arrive who sign contracts without reading the fine print and condemn themselves to an eternity of performances without rest in. This nightmare circus where the show literally never ends.